Hi, everyone. I am Kelly, and this is Vote Her In. Vote Her In is a collaboration between Two Broads Talking Politics and Rebecca Sive, who is the author of Vote Her In, Your Guide to Electing Our First Woman President. And I just realized when I was talking to Sarah before we started that today is actually the 4th anniversary of Two Broads Talking Politics. So
happy birthday.
Glad to have you all with us. I'm going to turn this over now to Rebecca, who will introduce our guest. Hi, Rebecca.
Hi, Kelly, and congratulations. That's terrific. I didn't realize that, but we couldn't have a more perfect guest, right? I mean, she is a leader of this new generation of women doing all kinds of exciting things. So I want to jump right in and introduce Sara Guillermo, who is the CEO of Ignite National. And they've just been out there running as fast as they can, working with young women, with really young women. I had to look up Generation Z, Sarah, but you're going to tell us more about that. So before we get into our discussion here, I do want to share with our listeners a bit of Sara's bio. It's pretty amazing, as are the bios of so many Two Broads and Vote Her In guests. So you know, she was an early founder, along with Ann Moses, of Ignite National, and really built it up into what it is today. And she was appointed CEO, I think, and took over in June or so. So she's gotten her feet wet in a new job. We're going to talk about what it's like to be, the buck stops here, right? As we go forward. And she is, has been involved in training upwards of, I think, 10,000 women across the country in the time that they've been going ahead. The other thing about Sara, which I totally love, is she's an engaged community member on issues that she cares about, and I imagine others around her care about. And so she serves or has served on the boards and been involved with organizations, including Seeking Common Ground, which you might tell us more about, Aspire Public Schools, and an organization called Build On, all of which have to do with community service and engaging young people. She's a breast cancer survivor. We're going to talk a bit about that as well, because she just is a role model in so many dimensions. And last, I wanted to mention to you all that Sara received something, this award, the Roddenberry Fellow for her vision and leadership, which sounds quite fitting to me. She has an MSW, which I think is quite interesting, from the University of Denver, and a BA in psychology from University of California at Santa Cruz. So you can see what a multi-dimensional, fabulous woman with that amazing smile she is. So I'll just jump in and say, welcome, Sara. And if you would, you all had some very exciting news earlier this summer, I guess, coming into fall, which has enabled you to really expand the program. And so if you can just share with our listeners how you got into this, why you have the kind of program you have, Declare Your Ambition, Run Now, which is just what I think people want to know. So welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Kelly, for having me this evening. I'm so excited to talk about Ignite all the time. Our organization, we're a movement of young women who are ready and eager to become the next generation of political leaders, the largest, most diverse organization that actually provides young women leadership opportunities across their lifetimes to be able to tap into their political power. We started in 2010, our president and founder, or our founder, scratch that, she's no longer our president, she will remind me of that when she sees this, started Ignite because she saw a gap and really thought about how could we get to young women as they're building their political ambition, as they're developing their interests, how can we get to them younger? Because at that time in, the early 2010, and that there was a really large gap of young women in the political sphere. And, both of you can probably imagine that it was hard to even convince women to run for office at that point. And so Ignite got started in 2010, and Anne's literally in her basement. And together we sat there for hours on end, writing curriculum, thinking about how we were going to, conquer high schools all across the Bay Area, and move from California to Texas, and then pivoted the model from a state by state perspective to a national movement in 2016 in advance of the 2016 presidential election. And we were really thinking at that point, how can we digitize, get our resources to as many young women as humanly possible. And also simultaneously at that time, our young women were getting older. They were no longer 14, 15, 16 years old. They were going to college. And so we're like, let's test out a college model too. And so we were starting to build college programming where young women could take what they were really excited about during their high school programs, take it to their college, university, continue to build young women's ambition, and start to see what we could do there. You all remember the 2016 election, and we thought we were celebrating the first female president. I know Rebecca and I have talked about this in prior times together. And at that point, the young women were like, where do we go? What do we do? And I remember so many young women calling, emailing. We had like 300% of download of our college resources in just 6 months. And it was crazy. And since then, we've really been working really, really hard to keep up with the demand. And here we are in 2021. As Rebecca shared, we were an awardee of the Equality Can't Wait Challenge, which was 10 finalists. And they had 6 awardees from Melinda Gates's foundation work, Mackenzie Scott and the Schusterman Family Foundation. And that pot of money is really going to help us accelerate our mission to get into communities all across the country. The other part that you just asked me about too is our Run Now programming. So out of the pandemic, we, sat with our young women at community roundtables, obviously virtually, sat virtually. And we were really talking about everything that was happening last summer with George Floyd and thinking about how can we accelerate your path either to the ballot or to the community board. And 2 things really came up out of that is they really were like, how do we just get on the ballot? I don't want to wait any longer. And so we piloted a program called Run Now, 20 hours of virtual curriculum where young women are understanding what's an endorsement, how do you raise your first $100, how do you get your website up, while they're also hearing from different consultants on the ground that are doing this work that will really help them launch their campaign. And we actually had a couple of our young women launch their campaigns during the program or are launching their campaigns for the 22 midterms. So it's been really exciting to see that. And I think where Ignite is headed is really thinking about not just the young women who are running for office, but really broadening the definition of who's a political leader. She's also a policymaker. She's also a commissioner. She's also really thinking about how is she mobilizing voters in her community. And so thinking about all of those different layers. And then, one of the most important roles is the campaign operative, who is a young woman who's going to be your campaign manager, help you raise the money, help you manage the money, help you mobilize your own voters. And so in the next chapter of Ignite, that's where we're headed, is we're still continuing to help young women build their political ambition in terms of thinking about running for office, but also deepening what it means to have political power and flexing that across their lifetimes.
I love that. So you and Ignite both have a deep commitment to diversity. I wanted to ask you about the strategies for recruiting diverse candidates. And, we all know, of course, that women and young girls are more likely to sort of look at themselves and think, I'm not qualified, I'm not ready, I can't do this, much more than men do. So what are the responses to that? What is your message to women, young women and older women, about why they should jump in and run or have whatever facet of political leadership they're looking to have?
Yeah, thank you, Kelly. We don't become an organization with the largest, most diverse organization by snapping our fingers and that happening overnight. It takes a lot of work about thinking about recruitment strategies, thinking about what it's like to go into school campuses at the high school level, at the college level, to really recruit young women. I think simultaneously, as we're developing messages about you can run, you can be a political leader, you can have political power, your vote is important. Simultaneously with those key messages, it's also a culture shift that is happening in this country. I mean, the 2016 election, I kid you not, accelerated this organization so fast. And then getting into the 2018 midterms, I think that there's a lot that's happening externally. And then we don't have to, unpack all of the pieces of what happened in the summer of 2020. But simultaneously with that, like COVID has unearthed every single issue that our young women have been facing for their entire lifetimes. And so when we're thinking about key messages and recruiting young women, we're really thinking about who are the people we're putting in front of them. Who do I look like? Who is the program person I'm going to hire? Who's the development person I'm going to hire? Who are the different humans that are running this organization that will continue to feed in? Because who you hire matters. The face you're looking at right now matters. And really thinking about how do we build, if I'm talking about shifting the face of democracy, I need to think about that at the beginning in my leadership. And then I need to think about that in my most frontline staff and how are they communicating this message.
So when you talk about shifting the face of democracy, right? What an expression. I love it. I wrote it down. I might use it, but I will footnote you. And you also talked about a culture shift. One of the things about the culture shift at Ignite that's so significant is you are becoming the CEO. Right? And coming from a fairly non-traditional background for that kind of role for an organization of this size. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit. You mentioned earlier the idea that there are many different ways for women to be political, and certainly being a CEO is one. Can you share with us how you think about that role, how you came to feel that you really did want to do it, that you wanted to show other women that they could do it too?
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the things that I credit Ann Moses to quite abundantly is her ability to really think about what's the next step in succession planning. And so, we had really prepared and thought very strategically about how are we going to do this as an organization. Obviously, the board had to vote me in, so that's a layer within that. But thinking about how do you communicate this to your internal staff? How do you communicate this to your donors? How do you communicate this to the external world simultaneously as we're applying for $10 million at the time? So, amidst a pandemic and amidst all of the different layers that happen. And so I feel like I was, a born leader in so many ways. And I was born to do this kind of work. Like, this is actually what excites me the most. Rebecca, you talked about my MSW. So for folks that are not social workers, there's a clinical track and there's a community track. And I ran as far away from the clinical track as I humanly possibly could. And I was like, I see big problems in this world, and that's what I want to solve. I see the critical, important piece about supporting people at the individual level, which I think hopefully makes me a really good coach. And the way that I want to use my time and my energy is to think about big problems. And I think that's what Ignite is doing. I think our young women are thinking about how do you create large scale solutions to the issues that we're finding in gaps in our democracy today. I have a young woman, Carla Garcia, who's in Dallas, Texas, who's the youngest woman of color on her school board in her mid-20s. And she is, during COVID, literally had to figure out, how do you do virtual learning? And now when they're going back to school, how do you negotiate teacher contracts? And that's the kind of human we need to be helping to shepherd those decisions, because she was a student there. Her siblings go there, like everything about it is so important. And when we're thinking about non-traditional paths to leadership, and specifically political leadership, that's what we want our young women to know. We don't want them to think that they have to go to law school. We don't want them to think that they have to go through this very specific path and they have to do this internship, because we all know this. The folks that do internships on the Hill don't look like me. And if they do, they got 10 scholarships to get there, and they're still trying to figure out how to make ends meet. And so I think a lot of what I talk about at Ignite with our team is how do we continue to do this for ourselves, but also for our young women. And then, you know, I have a couple of things that I really wanted to make sure the organization had, and given that we're growing, it gives us the opportunity to actually do so. But like, change doesn't happen overnight. And like policies, there's also, you know, the conversation that we can probably have ad nauseum, but is not the time for today, is, you know, when you get a woman of color in a position of leadership, there's a ton of expectation. They want you to solve the problems that they've had for their entire lives yesterday. And I'm like, okay, I've been here, you know, so and that's not just the staff, it's an entire movement of people that are looking at you. And so I think that there's a lot of learned lessons. I've been a CEO since June, and boy, has it been a busy summer. And I think, you know, there's a lot of listening to your team, or hearing your team, but really listening to your own intuition and thinking about how does that play a part. I have worked really, really hard to find time to think, because that's really challenging when you're the person that's in the mix of everything and you're doing everything. I was a doer, and then you're suddenly the leader. It's really hard to find time to think. And that's been a really big mission of mine over the past couple of months, to really make sure that I'm steering Ignite in a direction that makes sense. And then I think the last piece about being a CEO is like, culture is everybody, and culture is critical. And whatever is happening internally in the organization has to get reflected externally. And so taking a lot of thoughts around like values that served us when there was just Anna and myself worked really, really well for Sara and Anne, but values that were, you know, those may not work for the, you know, close to 20 people that we have on our team now. So we've been spending a lot of time really thinking about culture and how does that really play out for us as an organization, and what do we continue to do to upkeep it.
So Rebecca mentioned earlier that you're a breast cancer survivor, and you've been really outspoken about that. Could you talk a little bit about the perspective that brings to your approach to life, but to this work as well?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we start with our young women in every single program is, what do you want to change in your community? And the root of that question is, what is something that deeply impacts you that you want to shift? And I think for me, I was diagnosed with breast cancer the same week as Donald Trump's inauguration. And I was like, ooh, this year, 2017, is going to look a little different, and it's going to be a little harder than I thought. And so, you know, going through chemo, having to figure out egg freezing, having to go through a mastectomy, like I was like, oh, I'm going to be uneven for a period of time. Like, what will that look like? And like in the middle of like, you know, kind of the, you know, increase of my career, like, what do you do? And so I think, you know, obviously Ignite gave me a lot of time to be able to process through that, and gave me opportunities so that I could still do my job in the times that I could. And I think the big piece for me was, how do I then leverage the thinking around well-being at work? Because being stressed out, being exhausted, and that is all ridiculously relevant now as people are finding moments to work, and the different pivots as we were all navigating. How do we get our kids on Zoom while we get on Zoom? Well, oh God, there's no more internet, and trying to navigate that. So I think the importance of well-being at work has been really critical for me. We started to do well-being Fridays, where literally my personal trainer would do sessions with us. And then we did some summer Fridays where the team members actually just took the whole day off to really rest and rejuvenate. And I think that's really critical, because if we can't be both rested and well-minded for this movement, then none of us are going to be useful, because we're just going to consistently be exhausted and not want to do the work, because the ecosystem that Ignite lives in is pain. Like, we're talking about pain every single day. Like, to walk outside the door to be a young brown immigrant is not easy. And I think that's a narrative for a lot of our young women. And I think that that's something that we're talking about of how do you leverage that then to do good. So the other piece too that I really explored during 2017 was actually thinking about local politics, and that was a big piece with us at Ignite, the most local piece around boards and commissions. So because I was trying to get our young women to do it, I was like, I'll try it myself too. So I applied and got appointed to a healthcare commission here in Concord, California. And on my community board, I'm the youngest. I'm the only one that was like an active patient. And I think when you come with that level of perspective and you're leveraging dollars for the community, it really brings a different lived experience. And I think my fellow community boards are really grateful for that as an opportunity to think about who else could they have on these community boards, because I not only changed the conversation, but really shed light on what the rest of an entire population of individuals have that were never represented at that table.
So just to follow up on that, are there specific ideas that you developed or organizing strategies around recruiting women who have had health challenges and really want to contribute, for instance, as you have on that board? I mean, reaching out. I have a friend who runs an organization in Chicago, works with women who have various disabilities, and they're doing leadership training. And it's just incredible what's being accomplished, really helping those women have the fortitude and the backing to be out in the public sphere and be leaders. I'm wondering if there are things that you do along those lines.
Yeah, I mean, that's all our boards and commissions training. Like, that's the content of it. It's how is this lived experience of mine? How do I use it for good? As awful as it is. I mean, there are a number of our young women who have really, really hard experiences. Like, we can all name at least 5 hard things that have happened to us in our lives, right? Usually people call that like your transformational moment. But let's be honest, it's really the hardest part of our lives. And we're talking to that. I mean, that was the premise of the work that we were doing, is thinking about how do we get young women to think that the hardest part of their lives is actually their asset. And so that's the training, is really helping them think through and identify for themselves how Sarah, how your breast cancer journey, how can that actually support people, and doing it at, a very local level. And so that, I think, a lot of our young women have been able to gravitate towards. And then they're using it now beyond the commissioner world to think about it. Like, I really care. Here in California, we have an election for the governor, the recall our governor tomorrow. I mean, the election's been happening, but tomorrow is the last day to vote. And our young women are talking about what would that mean if we changed governors in the middle of leadership. And that is our personal story. And that's what they're calling and talking to voters about, to help mobilize them and build a personal connection.
So I know Kelly and I both want to hear from you. This is a question we love asking. It's really important. I think you've shared a lot of ways in which you advise the women you work with, but we always look to hear about maybe some unexpected kind of advice. And Kelly may want to add a little bit to that as well.
Yeah, just as you're thinking about things that that maybe wouldn't occur to everyone, as sort of things that would inspire them or help them along their path.
Yeah, I mean, I think for us at Ignite, it's really helping folks see and identify that political leadership looks so different for each and every one of us. Like, one of the things that our young women are like, well, I'm an introvert. I mean, I'm obviously an opposite of an introvert, but like, I have young women that are like introverts. They're like, Sarah, I can't go up and like talk to people the way you do. And I was like, great, we still need you. And I think that's the piece, is that there are multiple entry points to being a political leader and to be engaged, because we can't have a democratic process without participation. And so without all of us doing and playing our part, we're not going to see change. And so I think for as we're really continuing to think about how does political leadership look differently, it is a campaign operative. It is a person who is calling voters right now here in California to make sure that they vote in the recall election. It's a policymaker who's really going to think about what is a piece of legislation that I can write that will move policy better for all of us. A lot of our young women worked on the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, last year. They didn't know that it was like a different name like 10 years ago when I was working on it, but it's all around the same exact piece around voting rights accessibility. And like, that's a political leader. That is somebody, you picking up the phone to call a legislator, you writing a letter, you deciding to show up with your colleagues in DC or at your state house to talk with your legislators about your personal story and why it matters for a particular bill. That is political leadership. We've talked a lot about a commissioner and how that's a political leader. And then obviously candidates and electeds. A lot of our young women are running young. They're running for their, vice president on their school campus, or they're running for school board, or they're running for city council, and they're losing. And that's okay. The whole piece about running and getting your name out there and just literally that sheer entry point is so much experience. And if you're losing at 22 years old, I know you're going to run again. We have a young woman in Chicago. She ran for school board at 18, lost, ran again this last cycle and lost again. And she's like, okay, when's the next one? And that's who we need, because we are working to build a culture shift of young women who are going to be a part of the democratic process for their lifetimes, not just for like 2 years because I really care about this election. We're talking about young women who understand that there is an election every single day in this country and that they need to participate every step of the way.
So it calls to mind a phrase I believe in, which is every day is election day, as you know. I want to say in closing, heartfelt thanks, and we're waiting for you to run for governor. We're really excited about that. Write some great press releases. So we hope you'll come back and share with us what you're doing and how's it going, and our best to you and to Anne and everyone at Ignite.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.